Dr. Reneau Kennedy is a Boston University and Harvard-educated clinical and forensic psychologist and neuropsychologist who has worked for over 20 years as a researcher and practitioner in the field of law and psychology. She specializes in providing expert witness testimony for both criminal trials and civil litigation. Dr. Kennedy has been involved in policy creation and policy implementation for several state and private agencies, where the worlds of mental health and criminal justice link. Dr. Kennedy says her mission is to help people understand the purpose and dynamics of human behavior and to provide explanation for behavior in a larger context, and to help courts make determinations that are fair and equitable. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Reneau Kennedy to CU TV News today as she joins me in the studio for an exclusive one-on-one interview. Doctor, welcome to CU TV News. It's a real honor and pleasure to have you with us.
Well, thank you for that, Jim. I'm looking forward to spending some time with you today.
You know, I'm very fascinated. I like to sort of learn about the backstory of people a bit. Being a forensic psychologist, as you are, and you're traveling, across the country, if not the globe, doing the work that you do, what was your source of inspiration for the work that you do? If you look back and you think of maybe various paths you took and directives that came your way, even self-examination perhaps, what do you think in your own life has inspired you to do work that maybe not everybody else would be able to do so well?
Well, it came down to a fork in the road in my career. When people are studying their doctorates, what they have to do is they have to do placements. And I had planned on continuing in a college counseling center because I thought that's what I would be, as the director of a college counseling center, and that was my destiny. However, when I was interviewing with the first vice president at MIT, about shifting from the development office where I was working over to the college counseling center, she said to me, "Reneau, in 5 years' time, what would you like to be doing?" And I said, "Well, probably working in a college counseling center." And she said, "Okay, now let's think about 10 years' time. What would you like to be doing?" And I said, "Probably running the counseling center." So she said, "How much severe mental illness have you experienced in your work? And how much severe psychopathology and dangerousness have you experienced?" And I said to her, "Very little," because most of what I was dealing with was people who had problems of neuroses, broken hearts. There weren't any severe mental illness types of cases. And she said to me, "If you're going to be the head of a facility like that, you need just a little bit of an experience of it." And she said, "By the way, my husband runs a program for Harvard University at Bridgewater State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, and he trains individuals there to do dangerousness assessments. And also, that is a place that decisions are made about people's lives. And maybe this would be a good place for you to get that smattering before you go back to the college counseling center." And I thought about it, and I decided that probably that was what I needed to do to round out the necessity of my education for future, because people's lives would be in my hands. So that was the fork in the road, and Dr. Robert Fine picked me up, and he is the person that literally changed my life. And from that particular day of spending a day at Bridgewater State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, I learned about a whole new world of psychology that absolutely fascinated me.
Is that the point where you were deemed the murder maven? Or did that come later?
That came later.
That was when you did that dissertation?
Came later, yeah.
Wow.
My dissertation was done down there, and that particular facility, when individuals are found to be questionable about their mental status, they're sent there and they are evaluated for 20 to 40 days in terms of their competency, which means can they participate in their trial with their attorneys. At the time of the event, were they criminally responsible for what they did? Were they insane or not, is the common terminology. And then the third component of that is how dangerous is that individual. So somebody could be found not guilty by reason of mental illness, but they're also dangerous and will always be that way. So those kind of decisions have to be made by people who are trained to do it. And these folks at Harvard University were the best of the best, and I was lucky enough to be accepted there. And I did a practicum there, and then I was invited to do my internship. And then I did a postdoc, or a few years of postdoc, studying under these folks, and that's how my career essentially evolved.
You're described as a forensic psychologist, clinical and forensic psychologist, neuropsychologist. How do you define the work of a forensic psychologist, what you actually do?
Well, we start first with the issue of law, because forensic psychology goes into all different areas. It goes into family law, it goes into criminal law, and also goes into civil litigation. So it's that area of law that has a question about mental functioning. So that's where our expertise as neuropsychologists and clinical psychologists come into play, is who is this individual? How is it that their behavior has intersected with the question of law? And that becomes your target zone in which you're doing the research and the analysis to really answer a question for the courts about this particular individual.
Now, a lot of people watching may think that one of the primary purposes of a forensic psychologist is really helping to determine whether somebody is sane or insane. Is that part of the equation as well?
That's in the criminal sector, and yes, I do that. I do that for murder cases and all kinds of sexual assault types of cases. And also there comes a time when in civil litigation where people have to be evaluated for their competency because they might essentially be declining in their mental thinking, and they can't make decisions for themselves, and so that kind of testamentary capacity has to be evaluated.
So who hires you to do the work? Is it government agencies, corporations, individuals, everybody? How are you brought in? At what point is a forensic psychologist brought in on the scene in a trial?
Good question, and it's all of the above. So in a criminal matter, when a person comes to court in the beginning, there's oftentimes questions, particularly when there's severe violence that's involved. Was this person in their right mind or not? And then the component question that goes with that is, can this person cooperate with their attorney in such a way that they can understand the proceedings? Because in the United States, we believe under the Constitution that everyone has a right to a fair trial, and they have to be able to understand the proceedings to participate. So those questions come to play in the criminal types of cases. And so that's at the front end of it. Also, sometimes there are specific questions that need to be answered in a criminal matter. And those times are when I'm asked to speak about issues such as suggestibility and memory, and what do people really remember? What is something that they retain versus what somebody has told them? So I talk to the jury or to the fact finder about memory and its functioning and how we retain memories to be able to tell what it is the experiences are. So at different times I get called in depending on the nature of the question that's being asked.
That's incredible. Tell us about the types of legal situations and cases that you consult and testify in. Is it run across the gamut, or are there specifics that are sort of a niche for you?
No, it's across the gambit. I spend quite a bit of time in family court. And family court are those cases where parents are in such conflict that they can't resolve their differences as it relates to the best interest of children. So then a judge will appoint me to do the evaluation for the judge, and I will talk to the judge in a report as to what I think are the best interest of the children. And there what I do is I get to learn about the parents, about mother's point of view and father's point of view, and sometimes, depending on the age of the children, if they have reached an age of majority or agency, what we call, then they can give their opinions about things too. And that amalgam is what goes into a family court type of a situation. So that's family court. In civil court, these are matters where I'm working. For example, I have a case right now where several people died in an accident, and there were some survivors, and they are now litigating with the company that hired them about the long-term damage that they experienced being in a near-death type of situation. Another type of matter that I work with in civil litigation are those cases where we call IME or IPE, which is where someone says that they have been wronged in the environment, either by sexual harassment or by some discriminatory act. And it's my job to evaluate whether this person actually was a reasonable person and discrimination occurred, or whether there might be a purpose in their behavior that goes beyond the reality, which might be malingering or what we would call dissimulation, which is making the story much bigger so that there's secondary gain.
I would imagine, too, that during the course of your work that you come across situations, trials, legal matters that are pretty horrific, there's violence, there's murder, How do you face that as an individual yourself, seeing what you're seeing and learning what you're learning when you're on trial? And how do you have to be, I would assume, an extremely strong person. You have to be unbiased, but you have to be strong to be able to go in there day after day and hear and see the things that you witness.
There are some very sad stories, but the other part of that is those stories have to be told. You know, when people are killed, the victims' stories have to be understood, but also the question is, why did somebody do it? And so part of my job is to fill in those gaps, just like other types of forensic people do their forensic analysis on those sorts of things. My entry point is the mind of the individual to try to understand from a legal perspective what the purpose of their behavior was. And so my contribution is that component of it. And for me, it's very important, and every case is different.
So do you ever absorb, do you ever take it in, what you're hearing too? Does it ever affect you? Not in terms of decisions, but just as a person?
Certainly when a mother is telling me why she murdered her baby, it's very hard to hear because there's regret.
The humanity of it all.
Yeah, and that life is gone, and the life that took the child will be forever changed. So yes, I mean, I take it in, I hold it, I listen, but I also have to listen from the mind of somebody that's thinking of it from a psycho-legal question, because I'm answering a question for a judge. I'm not a social worker, and I'm not a therapist. My job is to answer a legal question, and so I hear the backstory, just like you were listening to me.
Right.
Yeah.
Do people confuse that? Do they think that you're a social worker or a therapist because they hear the word psychologist, so they assume that you're going to be able to, or you would be doing those other roles as well?
You've been preparing. That's a very good question, because no, before anybody sets with me and I go into it, we give what's called a non-confidentiality warning. So I explain to people that they are there voluntarily to speak to me, and that my information will be used in court, and that anything they can and do say to me may be incorporated in a report. And do they understand that? And then they have to tell me back what they heard me say so that I'm sure that they understood. And then with their consent, if they're an adult, we proceed. And if it's a child under the age of majority, I have to have their assent and their parents' consent to proceed. So yes, there's a strict rule set that has to begin even before I go into these cases.
I want to make mention too, which was fascinating, we talked about it prior to even rolling the cameras here, that I think it was in Massachusetts, you were one of the people involved in the creation of, is it for kids? Is it is it, sort of the way to really describe this so it's accurate? Kids who have committed crimes, who are under a certain age, and there's really no facility, no place for them, and they're sort of in a limbo. Tell us a little bit about that. You were very instrumental in the creation of that.
A number of years ago, when I was at Harvard University, I was doing research on murder. And I had done a 5-year study of domestic murders in Massachusetts. And then subsequent to that, I did another study of juvenile homicide. And in that, I was looking at how and why children kill. And I was approached by the state of Massachusetts to create what we would call the first high-risk holding facility for children who were killing. And they were either about to be waived up into the adult system, even though that they were children, or maybe kept down into the juvenile system where they would eventually be transferred over to a juvenile detention center. So my job at that particular point was to think about how do we create a program, and how is it that we do these assessments so that we can give the information to the court about a young life and provide the standards of practice that it gives the court the necessary answers to be able to say, should this person go up into the adult system because there's no habilitation, or is this potentially a child that could be habilitated and kept in the juvenile system and finally let out at age 21 or 23. And I did that in the state of Massachusetts, and then I was subsequently hired by the state of Kentucky, where there was a spate of children who were doing drive-by shootings. So I created the first juvenile high-risk facility in the country there.
Incredible. We were talking about family and civil litigations, but I'm fascinated about how you did get that nickname of the murder maven. When did that happen, and how did that happen? I know it's tied to that dissertation, but it's one that still holds today, right?
Well, when people start working in the field that I work in criminal violence, there's kind of a hierarchy. And low-level crimes don't have the valence or the interest, but murder is kind of the top of the heap. And not too many people get to do that type of a work. And I was fortunate enough with the people that I was working with at Harvard that knew that I was truly somebody that was interested and capable. And so they supported my decision to do a study for my doctoral dissertation of men who murder and to do a psychological analysis of that. So that research that I did then produced a number of different presentations and papers. And then after that, I was hired by the state of Massachusetts to study subsections of murder, like I said, which was the domestic murder, and then another study which was juvenile murder. So I was a researcher as well as an evaluator of people who do kill. So I guess that's where the expertise became. And so whenever I would do presentations, that was kind of a nickname that was given to me.
It's amazing. So would you say, if you were to look at the cases that you've worked on where you're working with violent offenders versus the family court and civil litigations, is there any one that draws you more, or any one that seems more interesting than the other, or is it truly case by case for you?
It's truly case by case, because every case is about someone's life. And whether it's the dissolution of a family and children not knowing what's going to happen to them, and mothers and fathers not knowing because they want all of the child themselves, those are heart-wrenching because lives are changed in custody evaluations. When we have people that are embittered with their workplace and they feel like discrimination has occurred, it's my job to listen and to evaluate based on a standard. So every case that I do is someone's story. It's someone's life, and it's my job to apply what I know about issues of mental health and mental illness to the question of law, to answer it for the courts so that whatever happens moves on. So for me, each one is very different.
So you're actually also a custody evaluator. I mean, some of your recommendations the judge takes into consideration when they're considering child custody, child welfare, right?
I'm appointed by the court in criminal cases by the judge to do the competency and criminal responsibility evaluations. So the court is asking me to do the work. And in the same way with family court, I'm appointed by the court. I am the custody evaluator who goes out of the courtroom because the judge can't take his or her robe off. It's my job to go out and do the investigation and to think of it from a psychological perspective and then package it into a report that then the judge uses to make those decisions.
Now, among everything else, you've also done multiple presentations too and speaking engagements. Do you enjoy that work?
I do.
Tell us what those are like for you.
Well, every year or so, I'm doing a presentation on a different type of topic, and that's part of my necessity to do so as a professional, and that's why we go to professional conferences so that we're sharing the information that's important to us, but it's also an opportunity for me to develop greater depth in a particular topic area. And then when I learn something like this, I then get the opportunity to share it. And so I've had quite a spectrum of things that I've presented over the years.
It's really a balancing act too, in a way, isn't it? Because there's so much legal complexity as well as emotional complexity in the work that you do, right?
It's always a matter of every case you always have to learn something new because the law is always changing.
Yeah.
So the standards and practice of law are always changing. Policies and procedures in which government people are involved in is always changing. And then, of course, you've got the human condition, which you overlap in all of those other two areas. So no two cases are ever the same.
Now, you also work as a consultant for state agencies on mental health as well, issues related to mental health. Tell us about that work and what that entails.
Well, the federal government is the protector of the Constitution of the United States through their agencies. And when different states are not in compliance with the constitutional rights of individuals who are institutionalized, whether that's in a mental hospital, whether that's in a prison or in a rest home, the state is in violation of what is called CRIPA, Constitutional Rights of Institutionalized Persons. So the Department of Justice sues the state to make them come into compliance. So they do what is national standard. And as a consultant, it's my job to go in and to help the state agency rectify or ameliorate its policies and procedures so that they are then disseminating the proper standards of care so that the institutionalized persons are then properly cared for under the Constitution.
Do you find a lot of situations where a lot of that is not happening and you're having to make recommendations for the betterment of more than people would even probably realize, right?
All the time.
Very important work that you do. And how do you protect the welfare of children without infringing on a person's rights? How does that, it's got to be a very delicate balance.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thought because in this country, we believe every person has the right to birth a child and to raise them and to give them their set of values and ethics that they believe that they have the right to impart. But when you have two opposing parties thinking that their way is better than the other way,
the only way, right?
Then there's this pull, and if they can't get it settled out of court, then the judge has to do it for them. And so the judge asks people like myself who study family law and human dynamics to say, well, what is in the best interest of these children given these two fighting parents?
So when you have that situation where the parents are fighting, it is, which we talked about before we went rolled the cameras, is the child is witnessing a war. Basically, they're in the middle of a war, right? Sometimes
That's right.
It can be really like that. You've seen that.
I have seen that, and it's painful for children because they love Prince Charming and Princess Aurora.
Yeah.
They want mom and dad to be together. But when mom and dad start warring, it's very confusing for children and painful, and then
They pit one against the other and try to
That's
fill the
exactly
child's head
right.
with things about the husband or the wife or
that's
what have
right.
you.
Daddy's all good and mommy's all bad, or vice versa, and then the stories start to embellish and children start to believe it, and then we get distortions, and then we get an issue which is now more and more understood, which is called parental alienation, where the child will refuse to see a parent. And sometimes that alienation could be for good reason, because a parent has beaten them or the child has seen things that would make the child reject the parent. But in other situations, it's because of what a child has been told. And that is where the poison occurs, and we have to think about how has this little soul been tainted, and what can we do to rectify it in such a way that this person can still love mommy and still love daddy and have the best of both of them.
How do you factor in the agency of the child? I mean, their future really rests on the will of the court.
Yes. We know that as children develop, when they're small, they don't reason well. So when children are about age 12, they move from concrete thinking to a concept in which they can start thinking abstractly, which is if then, what would be the outcome? So when I speak to a tween, somebody 11, 12, 13, what I'm assessing is, do they really have the capacity to weigh in and say, what are my wishes as well? And so when we're working with those tweens up to teenagers who are 17 or are making decisions, their preferences weigh in. So it's not just mom and dad at that point, it's what do the teenagers think about what's in their best interest. So when I'm interviewing them not only about mom and dad, but their hopes and wishes and where are they happiest, and how can we make a plan in such a way that they get what they need. And that's part of the issue for these guys.
Do younger children have an actual voice in the matter, or not so much?
Well, their voice is different, and the types of questions I ask them is, what is it that you like when you're at mom's house? And what is it like in a particular day? And then I go to, what is it that you don't like so much when you're at mom's house? And then I go the other direction. What is it that you like when you're with dad and in dad's house? And then I learn to try to understand the balances. And children say amazing things, and they tell you their story in their own way, but never do I ask them when they're of this young age, whose house do you want to live in? Because that's too much for a child to have to make a decision of, and that's not their job. It's their job to be able to love both parents.
I've heard of alienation within the family dynamic. Can you explain to us what that really means?
There's a number of different people who have done research on alienation, Jim, and what we do know is alienation becomes an emotional belief that one will hold that says that the other person is dangerous, and that the child then comes to believe that either mommy or daddy is someone that they don't want to visit, don't want to spend time with, and so they move their entire alliance to the other side, and they don't necessarily reason. And they can believe a lot of things that may or may not be actual facts. And that alienation means that they are rejecting half of their DNA, half of their life, and when that occurs, part of what we try to figure out is there a way to bring them back so that they can have half of the best of both parents.
And kids have so much coming at them now too. I mean, with technology and social media and bullying and the exposure to so much now that even we as kids didn't have exposure to. So a child today has a lot of things that are pressure filled, right, that you see, and that these situations just add to that, which then they can take with them, and when they are adults, there's unresolved issues that perhaps they can act out on in society that aren't so great because it's how they saw mommy and daddy handle it or the adults handle it when they were a child.
That's right. And we oftentimes have children that see their moms or dads' Instagrams and Facebooks and the things that are said about the other parent. And when you see it in writing like that, it's as if it's real, and they learn that that's okay for them to do because mom and dad are saying bad things, and we get more and more of it in the schools. So oftentimes I end up doing cases where children have said mean things in social media, and we've had to do evaluations about whether or not they're going to end up doing the things that they have threatened to do.
Now, ultimately, you're making the recommendations to the court.
Yes.
Do the judges typically go with your recommendations?
Well, the judges listen to components of it for sure, but as I'm sure you can imagine, it's a whole orchestration, because my opinion is one side, but there's also two people called attorneys, and the prosecution in criminal cases is going to tell their side, the defense is going to tell their side, there are witnesses, there are cases in law that are going to be argued, so I'm just one part of many in the criminal sector. In the family law sector, the judges certainly take what an expert has to say into consideration, but then again, you always get the polarization from one attorney to the other. But oftentimes in the custody matters, the attorneys, when they receive my reports, they will stipulate, which essentially means that there won't be the big arguments because they feel like I've done a thorough enough job and the recommendations I have given are fair, so there doesn't end up being a trial. They will then stipulate to the report, and then it'll be up to the judge to finally, make the recommendations.
How would you say, doctor, this work is similar, if it is, to the work you do with more violent offenders?
The work with violent offenders is short-term, in the sense of a crime has been committed, and we're looking at the culpability of that particular individual in terms of the reasons why they did what they did, and those evaluations are done where I'm not only interviewing the person, but oftentimes, let's say in a murder case, I might be looking at a stack of documents that are maybe 2 feet thick, so that there's more to it than just the act itself. And when I'm doing competency evaluations, which is the here and now, can this person work with their attorney, there are components of that interview structure that are really important to kind of look at, because when we're asking questions of competency, it's not only the facts of the matter, but it's also, can they work with their attorney in a reasonable way so that they can have a fair trial?
I understand you also do evaluation of possible sex offenders as well, right?
I do.
How do you remove your emotion from a case like that? That has to be very difficult.
Yeah, I do a lot of child pornography cases, child sexual assault cases. I work sometimes for the prosecution, sometimes for the defense. It depends on the nature of the case, but they're very difficult cases because we know that the stakes are high and oftentimes the evidence is not clear.
And there's a long-lasting effect, a scarring on if it actually occurred, and it's something that the individual deals with really for the rest of their life, right?
That's correct.
So it's a very delicate situation. How would you compare it to the other types of work that you do? Is it extremely
I think it is
deep? And
it is, because when you're looking at cases like this, you've got two things that you have to balance. One is a potential victim, and maybe a truth-telling victim, and maybe not, because there are false allegations. And then on the other side, there's someone who may be a perpetrator and who may not, but if they're found guilty, they're on the sex offender registry for the rest of their lives. They don't go to prison for a couple of years and then get out and no one ever knows. Their lives are changed forever. They can never have family. They cannot be around children. They can't be near a school. So it's a high-stakes decision that has to be made when we are working in criminal responsibility of those particular types of cases. So when I'm working with children, I want to make sure that those interviews are genuine. We're getting the memories from those children that goes to the fact finder, whether that's a judge or a jury, that are genuine, that are not implanted by someone, that are also understood, that meet the requirements of a particular law component, whether it was sexual assault, whether it was rape, whether it was indecent exposure, whatever it is, and making sure that the children's memories get accessed in such a way that that testimony is reliable to the fact finder. So that's very delicate work. But also in these types of cases, I've been through a number of them, where children tell their stories and their testimony comes through and the finding is not guilty. And part of what is important for me when I'm working in these areas is to remember to try to help the child understand that there's so much that goes on in a courtroom, that it's not whether the jury or the judge believe them, but there are other reasons why people are found not guilty. But also helping them outside of the courtroom, thinking about, you came, you told your story, your day is done, and now it's time for you to go on and heal, regardless of the decision.
because at the end of the day, it's really all about the law, right?
It's about the law.
So when you walk out of your door every morning, even though you're based in beautiful Honolulu,
Yes.
Hawaii, not a bad place to be,
Yeah.
but still when you walk out of your door every morning, you're more aware of the dark side of the world, probably more so than other people, because you see it, you hear it, live it, breathe it. Is that in any way a burden for you?
No, it's not. I feel as though what I've done through my career is to learn how to be able to have the opportunity to work in this area, number one, and it's high-stakes decision work, and it's not something where people can make mistakes. So I give it my absolute best, no matter what the case is, every day, because someone's life is at stake.
Through all of this incredible work that you do, Doctor, I would imagine that you've also learned about yourself and about how you think about things and your perspective and how you react to things. And you from every single situation, event, incident, trial, litigation, all of it, you probably learn about aspects of even yourself through that, right?
Constantly, because we all have
It's a very
bias.
definitive answer, yeah.
We all have bias, and it's easy for us to quickly judge and to go down, as I say, down one side of the teeter-totter or the other. But to be an expert, that's harmful, because that's where people start talking about hired guns. Mm-hmm. And those people are not particularly helpful to the court, because they're not imparting science, and they're imparting their own biases into something that just makes the matter worse. So I have to check myself constantly to make sure that my personal biases are not impacting on the work that I do, the way I'm thinking about a case, or the research that I'm looking at to just prove or disprove an issue. So my job is to stay as scientific as possible and to be as clear as possible about those components of psychology and law that merge, that answer the question that the judge needs to have answered.
With all that's going on in the world, or at least if you were to watch the 24/7 news channels, you would think the world's ending, that everybody is committing all these crimes and all these horrific things are happening. Do you find that the cases you work on or the litigation you're involved in, is it getting worse? Are the crimes getting more dramatic, and is it more often? Are things ramped up? In doing this for so many years, have you seen any sort of changes?
Yes.
An uptick, or what's happening out there?
Well, let's just take one segment that I've seen a huge increase in the last 10 years, and that is child pornography. Years ago, we had what was called the pulp media, which was magazines. And people looked at pornography in those particular types of ways, and it was sold as an adult pornography. But with the regulation of laws now, and now the dissipation of these magazines, where pornography comes is in the privacy of one's home on a computer. And people don't necessarily recognize when they're going into pornography that the slippery slope very quickly becomes child pornography. And so there's been a huge amount of individuals that I have done cases on where child pornography has increased. There's also been periods of time where I've seen a huge spate of murders, and then it lessens. So I would say...
And is that as a result of anything? Is it when the
Yes.
economy isn't good, or when, do you see spikes in certain areas due to other things that are happening in the world?
Yes. Let me give you an example. When I was doing a lot of work on domestic murder, when it was beginning to be recognized as a topic area and I was studying it, one of the things that I learned about was when do domestic murders occur, and one of the statistical components that came out, which is very telling, was 48 hours before or after a restraining order was issued are high-risk moments. Now the police know this, and also those individuals who are victims know it, and so that was a very important component to come out of it, and there has been a lessening of domestic murder as a result of we know those critical periods and how to speak to those individuals when the restraining orders are issued. And so when they learn it's between, when a recipient gets a restraining order and they learn it's between themselves and the judge, it's not between them and this other person, and that they have a duty to respond to the judge, that lessens the likelihood that they're going to go after their victim. So there are things that we learn about how to work within a system that changes the outcome of whether or not there's an increase or a decrease in murder.
How about technology? The fact that we now have the internet and we have social media, and there's bullying, not just child but adult.
Yes.
There's anonymous people that can say something and do something. We seem, or at least to me, it seems like we're living in a very reactionary time where a lot of times somebody will react, whether it's a shooting or a fight or a horrific comment or character assassination. We will just, if we perceive something we don't like, or if we want something we don't have, we're jumping and sometimes having to retract or apologize or say, I shouldn't have done that, or I overreacted, without thinking first. It just seems, because we've ramped up so much and we have all this technology and all this information coming at us, that we're living in a society right now, or at least a time, where we're jumping, reacting, and then doing and saying things that can be hurtful, harmful, sometimes horrific. Are you seeing that as a result of any technological influence?
Absolutely. Just about every case I have now is involving some sort of social media, where whether it's a family court matter, where there is texting, where there is Instagram, where there is Facebook. In a criminal case, oftentimes people will say things or even
make threats.
And particularly in the work that I do, I work oftentimes with digital consultants. So people may think that their history in a computer is gone once they turn it off, but it's forever there. So digital analysis of people's histories is very important, and as a psychologist, part of what I learn is how they think and feel, and the evidence is there through photography, through texting, through email, and through their searches on the internet.
Because I know that authorities now, when there is a crime committed sometimes, they will go to the person's Facebook page, and sometimes there will even be warning signs that were leading up to, sometimes even with suicide, there will be warning signs as well. But these warning signs, these maybe sometimes even wanting some attention, it'll be pre-announced on Facebook and not noticed, or other social media, not noticed until after it happens. So digging into social media and technology is a big component to all of this now, right?
It is. It's a part of the standard, what we call discovery packet, that prosecutors go for when they're looking at cases. And in family court matters, it's the same thing. That's all discoverable information, because it's the thinking and feeling that people have said that is not just in the air, it's in a record. And it helps me a great deal, because those words are quite different than just sitting in front of someone saying, oh, I never said that.
Right. Well, there it is.
There it is, more than once and in different types of ways. So yes, that psychological analysis of media and people's use of it and their production of it tells us a great deal about the psychology or the mindset of the individual doing the behaviors.
It's changed the game quite
Entirely.
a bit, hasn't it?
Entirely.
Does it require a special kind of person or a specific type of individual to do the type of work that you do?
Yeah, I think it does. And what I would say for anyone who's interested in this work is that this is a type of a profession when you're at the cutting edge. And that essentially means you can't be the average person doing it. It means you have to take your very best each day, and it can't be that you start at 8 and finish at 5. There may be 50 papers that you need to read that are related to a question, and if you don't read them, then you can't be well informed. So it's constantly learning. It's constantly working with national standards of professionals that are doing your work. And so it's an evolving career. And of course, you've got to have very good mentors. There are no textbooks that teach you how to be a forensic psychologist. There may be books about it, but where you learn to do this work is through your preceptors and your mentors who walk you through your cases, teach you about your biases, teach you about considerations of the things you're supposed to be thinking about. And it's that learning process, case by case, that you start to develop your career. And then after that is your consultation with your colleagues, so that you're always making sure that you're doing what's called national standard.
And if there's somebody who really likes to be busy, it's a great career, because you were telling me that you have a caseload that's going into months and months and months, all these different, a backlog almost of cases. That means you're incredible at what you do, and you're in high demand, and very skilled at what you do. And people look for your time and attention, but it is something that does require a lot of time and attention, right? It's almost like can be a 24/7 on-call, Dr. Kennedy, we have this coming up, we need you here, we need you there, flying across the country, Canada, all over. If you want busy, this is a great career for busy, right?
It is. Good forensic psychologists are in demand because the court wants good science. They don't want just an expert witness. What courts want are people that are going to be thinking reasonably and professionally and can write, as well as be able to speak, because sometimes when we do the work we do, and I would say probably maybe 3 out of every 10 cases I end up on the stand talking about whatever the question is that the court asks. So sometimes I'm asked just to write reports, and then if there is questions that need to be answered, I end up in court answering those questions before the fact finder with prosecution and defense, or in other types of cases, whether it's civil litigation, answering those questions. So yes, you always have to be your best, because there's somebody looking over your shoulder to say that you didn't do it correctly.
Why do you love what you do so much? I mean, in just the conversations we've had on the radio and then with this TV video interview, I see and I can identify and really, really understand the passion that you have, the determination to want to find fair and equitable results for people. But that inner core of who Dr. Reneau Kennedy is, where does that passion come from, and why do you love it so much, the work you do?
Well, you know, none of us think we're ever going to be in these difficult situations. When people get married, they think they're going to be married forever. And then they have children and they end up in war. And there's never a winner in these types of cases. And so if I can impart any kind of help through what we know through the research for best interest decisions, then I've helped a family. In cases where individuals have committed crimes of observing, download, and sometimes producing child pornography, individuals don't want to understand, how did this person get to this point? And it's my job to be able to understand that from a risk perspective, to be able to talk about what needs to be ameliorated, and can this person be released again? And that's a human life, but it's also taxpayers' money. When we're looking at situations like where we were talking about where someone kills, the decision is, does this person go into a not guilty by reason of a mental illness facility, which eventually leads them into a conditional release? Or is this a person that needs to be incarcerated, and our taxpayers' dollars go into that particular pit for the rest of their lives? And those are important decisions for society, because our tax dollars are going either way as a result of these wakes of tragedy. So for me, it's important to try to learn and to render some insight, given the work that I do in psychology.
It's been a real honor and a pleasure, Doctor, to have you with us on CUTV News Radio and CUTV News Television. It's fascinating to me, the work that you do, and you've really seen so much about the human condition, the human experience in the work that you do, right?
I have.
And you continued success in everything that you do. And continue, the good fight, I guess, is really what it is. It's the good fight.
Exactly.
It was a pleasure, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. To learn more about the incredible work of Dr. Reneau Kennedy, visit her LinkedIn page, or you can also find her at expertpages.com. For CUTV News, I'm Jim Masters.